Welcome to Heavy Storytelling. We are going to be reading a story, but first up we are going to be reading Romans 5, 3, and 4. Didn't look at the book. And then we're going to be reading Romans
12.
Chapter 12. And then we are going to be reading Around the World in 80 Days, Chapter 12.
No.
And 13.
No. We're significantly more into the book than that.
Yeah. What Mom said is true.
Sorry, I am wrong. But, yeah.
Okay, go ahead with the verse.
Romans 5, 3 through 4. Not only that, but we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. That is Romans 5, 3 through 4. But hope you guys enjoyed that. Now we're going to be reading a passage. Hi, Granny Bear! We're going to be reading a passage from Romans 12.
Dude. What is this?
He melted.
I'm melting!
We should read that.
Hello. Hello, this is me. So, JJ has been reading recently the verse of the day. And so basically we got this, it was a PDF that we bought online that just has a verse to copy every day. And I think it was originally made for homeschool, but we decided to do it, we decided to do it for our, part of our family time that we have here. So right before the live stream every day, we're copying these verses, and JJ likes to recite them, or actually just read them, when we are on the live stream. So the verse that I copied today, because we're actually a little bit behind, and because we haven't caught up ever since the wedding that we went to, which it's been a couple weeks now that we've been behind, but that's okay. The verse that I copied, but we're different places in being behind. So I did the verse for November 20th. And so this was actually really good, and so I just wanted to read this passage for you. It's from 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 10 through 17. You, however, have followed my teaching, my conduct, my aim in life, my faith, my patience, my love, my steadfastness, my persecutions and sufferings that happened to me at Antioch, at Iconium, and at Lystra, which persecutions I endured, yet from them all the Lord rescued me. Indeed, all who desire to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted, while evil people and impostors will go on from bad to worse, deceiving and being deceived. But as for you, continue in what you have learned and have firmly believed, knowing from whom you learned it and how from childhood you have been acquainted with the sacred writings, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith in Christ Jesus. All Scripture is breathed out by God and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness, that the man of God may be complete, equipped for every good work. Again, that's from 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 10 through 17. So that is what I copied today, and I thought that that was very good to... Yes, thank you. Thank you for the hearts. Okay, so... Poignant. All right, so I'm the one reading, so it's however I pronounce it is the way it is. All right, so, and if I pronounce it wrong, then it just became right. All right, so now we're on Romans chapter 12, as JJ introduced earlier. This is the English Standard Version, as was the 2 Timothy passage. This is the English Standard Version, Romans chapter 12. Let me Now we are, after some technical difficulties, and one of the technical difficulties that we had is I forgot to tell you about Romans chapter 12, because it completely changes course from what Paul has been talking about for the last 11 chapters, and then he finishes it off with the practical exercise of how to live the Christian life that he's been deliberating about for the last 11 chapters. So, also, chapter 12 is one of the most popular chapters in the book of Romans, I would say. More than half of the chapter is underlined, and honestly, the parts that aren't underlined are only not underlined, this is in my Bible, are only not underlined because I can't just underline everything, because then the underlining loses its effect. But you can see, like, I've got a whole ton of that is underlined. All right, so now we are on Romans chapter 12. This is the English Standard Version of the Bible, and I'm going to go ahead and begin. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. For as in one body we have many members, and the members do not all have the same function, so we, though many, are one body in Christ, and individually members one of another. Having gifts that differ according to the grace given to us, let us use them. If prophecy, in proportion to our faith. If service, in our serving. The one who teaches, in his teaching. The one who exhorts, in his exhortation. The one who contributes, in generosity. The one who leads, with zeal. The one who does acts of mercy, with cheerfulness. Let love be genuine. Abhor what is evil. Hold fast to what is good. Love one another with brotherly affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Do not be slothful in zeal. Be fervent in spirit. Serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope. Be patient in tribulation. Be constant in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints and seek to show hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be wise in your own sight. Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. For by so doing, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. That is the end of Romans chapter 12. It's kind of a short one compared to the last few that we've been reading. Romans chapter 12, lots of good stuff there that we could unpack, but that is not the purpose of this live stream. We don't have time to do so at this time. So, now we're on to chapter 26, that's a little different than 12, of Around the World in 80 Days. And so in the last few chapters, what happened was, Passepartout joined the circus, and everything just kind of fell apart, and the whole tent caved in. The elephants stampeded, and they trampled everyone, including Phileas Fogg, who Passepartout saw at the very end of his life, to death. And that is the end of the story. And here's Kimberly to say how it really happened.
Nice touch, Dad.
So what happened was, Passepartout joined the circus after, basically wandering around in,
Yokohama.
Yeah, in Yokohama. He wandered around in Yokohama and then joined the circus. Because he's like, hey, maybe I know where we were going, so maybe I could get passage there and try to find Mr. Fogg over there. So, he went over to the circus, did a performance, and he saw Mr. Fogg, and he jumped up in fright and made the entire pyramid fall down. And then he and Mr. Fogg and Iota went off to, yes, I remembered her name. They went off to the next steamer, which took them to, San Francisco, where Passepartout met up with Fix, and there was some clobbering that happened. That's a light way to put it. And then Mr. Fix, he said that because it is in his best interests for Mr. Fogg to get to England as fast as possible, he will stop hindering them in their trip and start doing everything he can to make them go faster. And he proved the point by taking a punch from this revolting person who was apparently voting for somebody in charge. And there were like two parties and they were fighting each other. And then I think they're about to get on the train. The next train. I'm going to hand it off to Dad, who's going to read a story.
So, it's very interesting, I think, that Jules Verne, he was French, and he writes, well, he doesn't write anymore because he's been dead for over 100 years, but he wrote stories, and he didn't always, the protagonist wasn't always a Frenchman. In this case, Phileas Fogg, arguably the protagonist is really Passepartout, but Phileas Fogg is, obviously the main character of the story, and he's English. It's interesting because he needed his main character to be English because the English were the ones that controlled the world at the time. They had the colonies in India, and they had the place in Hong Kong, and so they had all those territories that they could land, and they were on sovereign English soil, and so the story really worked only if Phileas Fogg was an Englishman, not a Frenchman. And if we ever get to read The Mysterious Island, for example, the story really only works if they're Americans, and it's kind of interesting. And even in the Journey to the Moon, whatever the
Center of the Earth.
No, Journey to the Moon. I can't remember the name. No, just be quiet. One of his books is something about going to the moon. Anyway, I can't remember the name of the title. But they're Americans, and it's very important that they're Americans, and they're actually retired Civil War artillerymen. And it's very important that this is the context that they come from when he's writing these books. So anyway, it's just interesting to see how he portrays these different nationalities and the importance that they have in his stories. So anyway, yes, okay, so JJ just called me out for rambling, but there's my little bit of analysis of the story. So we're on chapter 24, during which Mr. Fogg and party cross the Pacific Ocean. No, we already read that. We're actually on chapter 26. in which Phileas Fogg and party travel by the Pacific Railroad. Very clever titles for this story here. Yep, and JJ's giving me a thumbs up. All right, so here we go. Chapter 26. From ocean to ocean, so say the Americans, and these 4 words compose the general designation of the Great Trunk Line, which crosses the entire width of the United States. By the way, Kimberly forgot to point out that Passepartout bought himself 6 weapons when he was in San Francisco. I don't think you can even buy 6 weapons in San Francisco anymore, but probably can't even hold them. The Pacific Railroad is, however, really divided into 2 distinct lines, the Central Pacific between San Francisco and Ogden, and the Union Pacific between Ogden and Omaha. 5 main lines connect Omaha with New York. New York and San Francisco are thus united by an uninterrupted metal ribbon which measures no less than 3,786 miles. Can we all sit down and be stable?
We are. The dog's being ridiculous.
Chrissy, go.
All right, come on.
I'm... Oh, I need JJ to settle, because he was like... Right. New York and 3,786 miles. Between Omaha and the Pacific, the railway crosses a territory which is still infested by Indians and wild beasts, and large tract with the Mormons after they were driven from Illinois in 1845 began to colonize. Colonize. The journey from New York to San Francisco consumed, formerly under the most favorable conditions, at least 6 months. It is now accomplished in 7 days. It was in 1862 that, in spite of the Southern members of Congress who wished a more southerly route, it was decided to lay the road between the 41st and 42nd parallels. President Lincoln himself fixed the end of the line at Omaha in Nebraska. The work was at once commenced and pursued with true American energy, nor did the rapidity with which it went on injuriously affect its good execution. The road grew on the prairies 1.5 miles a day. A locomotive running on the rails laid down the evening before brought the rails to be laid on the morrow, and advanced upon them as fast as they were put in position. The Pacific Railroad is joined by several branches in Iowa, Kansas, Colorado, and Oregon. On leaving Omaha, it passes along the left bank of the Platte River as far as the junction of its northern branch, follows its southern branch, crosses the Laramie Territory and the Wasatch Mountains, turns the Great Salt Lake and reaches Salt Lake City, the Mormon capital, plunges into the Tooele Valley across the American desert, Cedar and Humboldt Mountains, the Sierra Nevada, and descends via Sacramento to the Pacific, its grade, even on the Rocky Mountains, never exceeding 112 feet to the mile. Such was the road to be traversed in 7 days, which would enable Phileas Fogg, at least so he hoped, to take the Atlantic steamer at New York on the 11th for Liverpool. The car which he occupied was a sort of long omnibus on 8 wheels, and with no compartments in the interior. It was supplied with 2 rows of seats perpendicular to the direction of the train on either side of an aisle which conducted to the front and rear platforms. These platforms were found throughout the train, and the passengers were able to pass from one end of the train to the other. It was supplied with salon cars, balcony cars, restaurants, and smoking cars. Theater cars alone were wanting, and they will have these someday. Book and news dealers, sellers of edibles, drinkables, and cigars, who seemed to have plenty of customers, were continually circulating in the aisles. The train left Oakland Station at 6 o'clock. It was already night, cold and cheerless, the heavens being overcast with clouds which seemed to threaten snow. The train did not proceed rapidly, counting the stoppages. It did not run more than 20 miles an hour, which was a sufficient speed, however, to enable it to reach Omaha within its designated time. There was little conversation in the car, and soon many of the passengers were overcome with sleep. Passepartout found himself beside the detective, but he did not talk to him. After recent events, their relations with each other had grown somewhat cold. There could no longer be mutual sympathy or intimacy between them. Fix's manner had not changed, but Passepartout was very reserved, and ready to strangle his former friend on the slightest provocation. Snow began to fall an hour after they started, a fine snow, however, which happily could not obstruct the train. Nothing could be seen from the windows but a vast white sheet, against which the smoke of the locomotive had a greyish aspect. At 8 o'clock a steward entered the car and announced that the time for going to bed had arrived, and in a few minutes the car was transformed into a dormitory. The backs of the seats were thrown back, bedsteads carefully packed were rolled out by an ingenious system, berths were suddenly improvised, and each traveler had soon at his disposition a comfortable bed, protected from curious eyes by thick curtains. The sheets were clean and the pillows soft. It only remained to go to bed and sleep, which everybody did, while the train sped on across the state of California. The country between San Francisco and Sacramento is not very hilly. The Central Pacific, taking Sacramento for its starting point, extends eastward to meet the road from Omaha. The line from San Francisco to Sacramento runs in a northeasterly direction along the American River, which empties into San Pablo Bay. The 120 miles between these cities were accomplished in 6 hours, and toward midnight, while fast asleep, the travelers passed through Sacramento, so that they saw nothing of that important place, the seat of the state government, with its fine quays, its broad streets, its noble hotels, squares, and churches. The train, on leaving Sacramento and passing the Junction, Rocklin, Auburn, and Colfax, entered the range of the Sierra Nevada. Cisco was reached at 7 in the morning, and an hour later the dormitory was transformed into an ordinary car, and the travelers could observe the picturesque beauties of the mountain region through which they were steaming. The railway track wound in and out among the passes, now approaching the mountain sides, now suspended over precipices, avoiding abrupt angles by bold curves, plunging into narrow defiles which seemed to have no outlet. The locomotive, its great funnel emitting a weird light with its sharp bell, and its co-watcher extended like a spur, mingled its shrieks and bellowings with the noise of torrents and cascades, and twined its smoke among the branches of the gigantic pines. There were few or no bridges or tunnels on the route. The railway turned around the sides of the mountains, and did not attempt to violate nature by taking the shortest cut from one point to another. The train entered the state of Nevada through the Carson Valley about 9 o'clock, going always northeasterly, and at midday reached Reno, where there was a delay of 20 minutes for breakfast. From this point, the road, running along Humboldt River, passed northward for several miles by its banks. Then it turned eastward and kept by the river until it reached the Humboldt Range, nearly at the extreme eastern limit of Nevada. Having breakfasted, Mr. Fogg and his companions resumed their places in the car, and observed the varied landscape which unfolded itself as they passed along the vast prairies, the mountains lining the horizon, and the creeks with their frothy, foamy streams. Sometimes a great herd of buffaloes massing together in the distance seemed like a movable dam. These innumerable multitudes of ruminating beasts often form an insurmountable obstacle to the passage of the trains. Thousands of them have been seen passing over the track for hours together in compact ranks. The locomotive is then forced to stop and wait till the road is once more clear. This happened indeed to the train in which Mr. Fogg was traveling. About 12 o'clock, a troop of 10 or 12,000 head of buffalo encumbered the track. The locomotive, slackening its speed, tried to clear the way with its cow-catcher, but the mass of animals was too great. The buffaloes marched along with a tranquil gait, uttering now and then deafening bellows. There was no use of interrupting them, for having taken a particular direction, nothing can moderate and change their course. It is a torrent of living flesh which no dam could contain. The travelers gazed on this curious spectacle from the platforms, but Phileas Fogg, who had the most reason of all to be in a hurry, remained in his seat and waited philosophically until it should please the buffaloes to get out of the way. Passepartout was furious at the delay they occasioned, and longed to discharge his arsenal of revolvers upon them. "What a country!" replied he. "Mere cattle stop the trains!" Sorry. Oh, my French is bad today. "And go by in the procession, just as if they were not impeding travel. Parbleu! I should like to know if Monsieur Fogg foresaw this mishap in his programme, and here's an engineer who doesn't dare to run the locomotive into the herd of beasts." The engineer did not try to overcome the obstacle, and he was wise. He would have crushed the first buffaloes, no doubt, with the cow-catcher, but the locomotive, however powerful, would soon have been checked. The train would inevitably have been thrown off the track, and would then have been helpless. The best course was to wait patiently, and regain the lost time by greater speed when the obstacle was removed. The procession of buffaloes lasted 3 full hours, and it was night before the track was clear. The last ranks of the herd were now passing over the rails, while the first had already disappeared below the southern horizon. It was 8 o'clock when the train passed through the defiles of the Humboldt Range, and 9:30 when it penetrated Utah, the region of the Great Salt Lake, the singular colony of the Mormons. Chapter 27, in which Passepartout undergoes, at a speed of 20 miles an hour, a course of Mormon history. During the night of the 5th of December, the train ran southeasterly for about 50 miles, then rose an equal distance in a northeasterly direction toward the Great Salt Lake. Passepartout, about 9 o'clock, went out upon the platform to take the air. The weather was cold, the heavens gray, but it was not snowing. The sun's disk, enlarged by the mist, seemed an enormous ring of gold, and Passepartout was amusing himself by calculating its value in pounds sterling, when he was diverted from this interesting study by a strange-looking personage who made his appearance on the platform. This personage, who had taken the train at Elko, was tall and dark, with black mustache, black stockings, a black silk hat, a black waistcoat, black trousers, a white cravat, and dogskin gloves. He might have been taken for a clergyman. He went from one end of the train to the other, and affixed to the door of each car a notice written in manuscript. Passepartout approached and read one of these notices, which stated that Elder William Hitch, Mormon missionary, taking advantage of his presence on the train number 48, would deliver a lecture on Mormonism in car number 117 from 11 to 12 o'clock, and that he invited all who were desirous of being instructed concerning the mysteries concerning the mysteries of the religion of the Latter-day Saints to attend. "I'll go," said Passepartout to himself. He knew nothing of Mormonism except the custom of polygamy, which is its foundation. The news quickly spread through the train, which contained about 100 passengers, 30 of whom, at most, attracted by the notice, ensconced themselves in car number 117. Passepartout took one of the front seats. Neither Mr. Fogg nor Fix cared to attend. At the appointed hour, Elder William Hitch rose and, in an irritated voice, as if he had already been contradicted, said, "I tell you that Joe Smith is a martyr, that his brother Hiram is a martyr, and that the persecutions of the United States government against the prophets will always make a martyr of Brigham Young. Who dares to say to the contrary?" No one ventured to gainsay the missionary, whose excited tone contrasted curiously with his naturally calm visage. No doubt his anger arose from the hardships to which the Mormons were actually subjected. The government had just succeeded with some difficulty in reducing these independent fanatics to its rule. It had made itself master of Utah and subjected that territory to the laws of the Union after imprisoning Brigham Young on a charge of rebellion and polygamy. The disciplines of the prophet had since redoubled their efforts and resisted, by words at least, the authority of Congress. Elder Hitch, as is seen, was trying to make proselytes on the very railway trains. Then, emphasizing his words with his loud voice and frequent gestures, he related the history of the Mormons from biblical times, how that in Israel, Mormon prophet of the tribe of Joseph published the annals of the new religion and bequeathed them to his son Mormon. How, many centuries later, a translation of his precious book, which was written in Egyptian, was made to Joseph Smith, Jr., a Vermont farmer who revealed himself as a mystical prophet in 1825, and how, in short, the celestial messenger appeared to him in an illuminated forest and gave him the annals of the Lord. Several of the audience, not being much interested in the missionary's narrative, here left the car, but Elder Hitch continuing his lecture, related how Smith, Jr., with his father, 2 brothers, and a few disciples, founded the Church of the Latter-day Saints, which adopted not only in America, but in England, Norway, and Sweden, and Germany, counts many artisans as well as men engaged in the liberal professions among its members, how a colony was established in Ohio, a temple erected there at a cost of $200,000, and a town built at Kirkland, how Smith became an enterprising banker and received from a simple mummy showman a papyrus scroll written by Abraham and several famous Egyptians. Isn't that nice? The elder's story became somewhat wearisome, and his audience grew gradually less, until it was reduced to 20 passengers. But this did not disconcert the enthusiast, who proceeded with the story of Joseph Smith's bankruptcy in 1837, and how his ruined creditors gave him a coat of tar and feathers, his reappearance some years afterward, more honorable and honored than ever, at Independence, Missouri, the chief of a flourishing colony of 3,000 disciples, and his pursuit thence by outraged Gentiles and retirement into the far west. 10 hearers only were left now, among them honest Passepartout, who was listening with all his ears. Thus he learned that after long persecutions, Smith reappeared in Illinois, and in 1839 founded a community at Nauvoo, on the Mississippi, numbering 25,000 souls, of which he became mayor, chief justice, and general-in-chief, that he announced himself in 1843 as a candidate for the presidency of the United States, and that finally, being drawn into ambuscade in Carthage, he was thrown into prison and assassinated by a band of men disguised in masks. Passepartout was now the only person left in the car, and the elder, looking him full in the face, reminded him that 2 years after the assassination of Joseph Smith, the inspired prophet Brigham Young, his successor, left Nauvoo for the banks of the Great Salt Lake, where, in the midst of that fertile region, directly on the route of the immigrants who crossed Utah on their way to California, the new colony, thanks to the polygamy practiced by the Mormons, had flourished beyond expectations. And this, added Elder William Hitch, this is why the jealousy of Congress has been aroused against us. Why have the soldiers of the Union invaded the soil of Utah? Why has Brigham Young, our chief, been imprisoned in contempt of all justice? Shall we yield to force? Never. Driven from Vermont, driven from Illinois, driven from Ohio, driven from Missouri, driven from Utah, we shall yet find some independent territory on which to plant our tents. And you, my brother, continued the elder, fixing his angry eyes upon the single auditor, will you not plant yours there too, under the shadow of our flag? No, replied Passepartout courageously, in his turn retiring from the car, and leaving the elder to preach to vacancy. During the lecture, the train had been making good progress, and toward 12:30 it reached the northwest border of the Great Salt Lake. Thence the passengers could observe the vast extent of the interior sea, which is also called the Dead Sea, and into which flows the American Jordan. It is a picturesque expanse, framed in lofty crags in large strata, encrusted with white salt, a superb sheet of water, which was formerly of larger extent than now, its shores having encroached with a lapse of time, and thus at once reduced its breadth and increased its depth. The Salt Lake, 70 miles long and 35 wide, is situated 3 miles 800 feet above the sea. 3 miles 800 feet above the sea. Quite different from Lake Asphaltite, whose depression is 1,200 feet below the sea. It contains considerable salt, and 1/4 of the weight of its water is solid matter, its specific weight being 1,170, and after being distilled 1,000. Fishes are, of course, unable to live in it, and those which descend through the Jordan, the Weber, and the other streams should perish. The country around the lake was well cultivated, for the Mormons are mostly farmers, while ranchers and pens for domesticated animals, fields of wheat, corn, and other cereals, luxuriant prairies, hedges of wild rose, clumps of acacias, and milkwort would have been seen 6 months later. Now the ground was covered with a thin powdering of snow. The train reached Ogden at 2 o'clock, where it rested for 6 hours. Mr. Fogg and his party had time to pay a visit to Salt Lake City, connected with Ogden by a branch road, and they spent 2 hours in this strikingly American town, built on the pattern of other cities of the Union, like a checkerboard, with the somber sadness of right angles, as Victor Hugo expresses it. The founder of the City of the Saints could not escape from the taste for symmetry which distinguishes the Anglo-Saxons. In this strange country, where the people are certainly not up to the level of their institutions, everything is done squarely, cities, houses, and follies. The travelers, then, were promenading at 3 o'clock about the streets of the town built between the banks of the Jordan and the spurs of the Wasatch Range. They saw few or no churches, but the prophet's mansion, the courthouse, and the arsenal, blue brick houses with verandas and porches, surrounded by gardens bordered with acacias, palms, and locusts. A clay and pebble wall, built in 1853, surrounded the town, and in the principal street were the market and several hotels adorned with pavilions. The place did not seem thickly populated. The streets were almost deserted, except in the vicinity of the temple, which they only reached after having traversed several quarters surrounded by palisades. There were many women, which was easily accounted for by the peculiar institution of the Mormons. But it must not be supposed that all the Mormons are polygamists. They are free to marry or not, as they please, but it is worth noting that it is mainly the female citizens of Utah who are anxious to marry, as, according to the Mormon religion, maiden ladies are not admitted to the possession of its highest joys. Though these poor creatures seem to be neither well off nor happy. Some, the more well-to-do, no doubt, wore short, open, black silk dresses under a hood or modest shawl. Others were habited in Indian fashion. Passepartout could not behold without a certain fright these women, charged in groups with conferring happiness on a single Mormon. His common sense pitied above all the husband. It seemed to him a terrible thing to have to guide so many wives at once across the vicissitudes of life, and to conduct them, as it were, in a body to the Mormon paradise, with the prospect of seeing them in the company of the glorious Smith, who doubtless was the chief ornament of that delightful place to all eternity. He felt decidedly repelled from such a vocation, and he imagined, perhaps he was mistaken, that the fair ones of Salt Lake City cast rather alarming glances on his person. Happily, his stay there was but brief. At 4, the party found themselves again at the station, took their places in the train, and the whistle sounded for starting. Just at the moment, however, that the locomotive wheels began to move, cries of "Stop! Stop!" were heard. Trains, like time and tide, stopped for no one. The gentleman was uttered who uttered the cries was evidently a belated Mormon. He was breathless with running. Happily for him, the station had neither gates nor barriers. He rushed along the track, jumped on the rear platform of the train, and fell exhausted into one of the seats. Passepartout, who had been anxiously watching this amateur gymnast, approached him with lively interest and learned that he had taken flight after an unpleasant domestic scene. When the Mormon had recovered his breath, Passepartout ventured to ask him politely how many wives he had, for from the manner in which he had decamped, it might be thought that he had 20 at least. "One, sir," replied the Mormon, raising his arms heavenward. "One, and that is enough." And that's the end of chapter 27. And we will read chapter 28 tomorrow. I hope you're enjoying Around the World in 80 Days. And it looks like we've got an art gallery coming. So here we are. I hope you enjoyed this video. Here's the art gallery. And God bless you. Have a good night.
Okay, so I am not known for putting color into my pictures.
It's nice shading, though.
Yeah, this is my first time shading anything like this. It's one of my favorite that I've ever done.
There's a sun.
JJ, do you want to
Hit the like button if you like the tank.
JJ, do you want to do the outro?
What number is the tank? What's the designation?
7635. It's just an American tank. It's not really a real tank. I just made it up.
Oh, okay.
Okay, see ya.
See ya.
Bye. God bless.